Back in 2017, I drove from Dublin up to Belfast, and along the way, I crossed this one memorial, which originally I thought was in Crossmaglen. However, it's only a couple hundred meters into the Republic of Ireland. Here you have the memorial to the South Armagh Brigade, a brigade of the IRA which continued fighting oftentimes long after peace negotiations had been signed. South Armagh was one of the most heavily Irish countries or Irish counties to be involved in the troubles. So the violence here continued well up into the early 2000s, which is evidenced by volunteer Keith Rogers. Says he was murdered by criminals, but in reality it appears to be some sort of a drug bust gone wrong. I'm not going to make any kind of judgment against him, but he was what's called a dissident IRA member. An IRA member which belongs to an organization that, although still Republican and supportive of the IRA's goals, tended to continue even when peace negotiations had been signed. So Sinn Féin would support him and lay memorial wreaths at his grave, but they would kind of distance themselves from the politics of the groups involved. Here's his grave in the local cemetery just within the Republic of Ireland, and as such, British police could not really enforce the rule of law down here. There's been a lot of instances of IRA members showing up in the middle of the night and shooting off guns, retreating back to Crossmaglen, and vice versa, because police can't go both ways. And just a couple feet away from him is another IRA member, also of the 1st Battalion of South Armagh, which is, again, just another young man whose life was taken in the conflict. And over here again is the family plot of Keith Rogers, who have decided not to really memorialize him as much as other IRA members. Looking out over the churchyard, again, I'm standing in the same churchyard. It's a football field which would have been used, and oftentimes people would be recruited because it was a good source of people who felt strongly about their nation representing in sports and would have been recruited from these football matches. But anyway, here we're driving from the southern area of Crossmaglen, or the area just south of Crossmaglen in the Republic of Ireland, into Crossmaglen itself, into Northern Ireland. And if you take a look on the right side where all these traffic cones are, that's actually where the border is. Nowadays, there's actually no real hard border, and it was here that a ambush happened whereby members of the community contacted the provisional IRA and told them that 4 Royal Fusiliers had showed up to set up an observation post. And the IRA ambushed them and killed 3 and thought the 4th was dead, and they apparently were driving back to the Republic of Ireland, shouting "Up the Ra" and laughing. And this is what called for the deployment of SAS soldiers into the town. And it was such a heavily Irish community, this community right here we're looking at, that they had to be deployed only by helicopter. Now, these are 4 flags of the traditional Irish counties, and the first one is important because it's the Red Hand of Ulster. That's Northern Ireland, and it would have also included historically the county of Donegal. And if you look up here, I believe this is Munster, represented by 3 crowns. To the right is just representing Ireland, and this is another county which historically has a German coat of arms from Bavaria, which is pretty interesting. But if you take a look at these, you have the revolutionary Irish flag. The first one in the middle is obviously the traditional Irish flag, green representing the Irish, white for peace, and orange for the British minorities here. This is Fianna's flag, who historically battled the Roman incursions into Britain, and this is the flag of Inla for the Irish National Liberation Army, represented by a starry depiction of the Big Dipper. Now, going through the rest of Crossmaglen, we've got here, I believed initially this was an old police station, but it's just a memorial to the IRA set up by the Republican community. Now, usually they will say things like erected by the people of Crossmaglen or the Crossmaglen Republican movement. Yeah, this H block IRA political prisoner memorial erected by the Republican movement. Now, they can't necessarily say that they're members of the IRA within Northern Ireland because they'll be targeted by British police, but they do say this usually just south of the border, and also there are signs around here that do show roll of honor for South Armagh Brigade, and they can do this technically off of the technicality that the IRA itself has declared a ceasefire. And you've got quotes from various Irish Republicans, and back to walking around the town again, you can see surprising support for the NHS just below the South Armagh Brigade billboard. And looking up the road, you can see many street battles would have taken place here, many riots. In fact, just up the road from where we're looking right now is where the police station still is, with a lot of damage that I'll take a look at in just a moment. And down here is just, I guess you could call it the road to Belfast. Surprising again, support for the NHS, but Liam Campbell was a IRA prisoner recently arrested. Uh, Looking now, we can see the old observation post, which has been torn down, but the police station looks almost exactly the same, down to the damage that's been caused to it. And a lot of this damage has been done by dissident Republicans or just local football hooligans who get drunk after a game and go and set off fire bombs and petrol bombs near the base of it, ram it with their car, and then drive off. And a lot of it is police just don't want to show up and fix it because that'll have a presence there that is an easily targeted thing. Just north of town, as you drive up to Belfast, is this memorial to the eight black prisoners who were people who went on hunger strikes, people who refused to wear clothes, would only wear blankets, and many of them actually died because of these protests. I am headed more up into Armagh itself, which is the capital, obviously, of the County Armagh. And what is wrongly characterized by a lot of sympathetic media as being 100% Irish is, in fact, a community which does have a sizable British population. And I found this just walking through the streets of Armagh, where a lot of this violent sectarianism happened. Now, there's a huge Irish community within this large town, but just by looking at all the banners and all of the symbolism, you can tell, well, first of all, 12th of July just happened, which was a big celebration for the Protestant community. But you can see the symbols of the Orange Order. And this is also reflected in the police stations, which have to be heavily, heavily fortified because of the presence of competing Loyalist militias and Republican movements, paramilitary groups, huge walls erected to stop firebombs. And actually, looking here, it's just an interesting historical fact that within Northern Ireland itself, which is now British territory, you have the grave of Brian Beru. Now, he was the last High King of Ireland, a position that was later attempted to be reestablished by the son of Robert the Bruce in their wars with Britain, and specifically their incursion into Ireland to try to establish a sort of Gaelic Scottish kingdom. But moving on towards what I thought was the site of the Lockgull Ambush, you have actually the community of Moy in County Tyrone. Here you have the Protestant church, and looking across the street, you have just literally to the right of this shot the Catholic Church. And this shows in these communities oftentimes a thriving presence of both Catholics and Protestants. And expecting to find the graves of the Lochgull martyrs, I found, or what is called the Lochgull martyrs, I found Charles and Teresa Fox, an elderly Irish couple who was murdered by members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, a pro British militia. Now, as recently as 2015, the son of these people came forward and said that the investigation was flawed. And this is because there's a lot of allegations that the UVF was more or less teaming up with British police, British military, and that a lot of the UVF members were retired British police or military or even active duty. And because this town was dual ethnic, there were a lot of tit for tat killings in it. And you can see the sort of tension that's even today present by this site, which is the site of the Orange Hall. The Orange Hall aims to be a Protestant sort of fraternal order which remembers William of Orange, who had cemented control over Ireland. But here again is the village of Loch Gall, which is famous for one, it's a outpost of Britain, and two, it was the site of a very, very famous ambush. And the Loch Gall ambush has the distinction of being the single greatest loss of life for the IRA in any operation. They drove up to a Royal Ulster Constabulary, a British police post, with a bomb and tried to set it off while the other seven members opened fire. And all members of the IRA were shot and killed by special members of the British Special Air Service, basically Britain's Navy SEALs. And this is, I believe, the first time that people were made aware of the presence of the SAS. Now, two of these men were unarmed when they were involved in this ambush, and an additional civilian was killed and another one injured. And they're considered sort of martyrs for the cause, even though they were killed on active duty, taking part in an ambush. Here in the village, you can also see the plaque to members of the RUC and members of the British policing force that were killed in these operations throughout the Troubles, and even into more modern days. And what's always chilling is the blank spaces left underneath them, basically expecting more British police and civilians to be killed. This is present on a huge number of monuments, but the village of Lockgull is very heavily British, at least from what I saw. I believe this building right here to the right is the old courthouse, and the Lockgull Ambush has the distinction of being it's included in a lot of sort of Irish Republican folk music, and it's become a sort of battle cry for the IRA. Even though because the IRA views these communities and the Irish Republicans view these communities as sort of settlers, as sort of colonialists. They move into areas that the IRA and the Republicans believe used to be Irish. But anyway, here we have just driving around. This is another community which is only a stone's throw from the Irish border, proudly flying the British flag. And this is to sort of disprove the idea that Brits are only involved in areas around Belfast. They're present all over Northern Ireland. And I saw a lot of orange halls, in fact, as well in Southern Ireland. But in this community of Dungannon is the grave of Martin Hurston, who was a very famous member of the Provisional IRA to die in the hunger strikes. These were done at the H Block, and he was only 24 years old. He died after 46 days of starvation from health-related complications. And also interesting is the fact that there are other members of the Provisional IRA buried as well in this cemetery. Now, this one, it's incredibly sad. He's only 17 years old, and he was murdered on active duty by they called them agents of British imperialism, but most likely British police or the SAS or paratroopers. They draw no distinction between whether they're military or civilians like the UVF. The IRA considers them all agents of imperialism. This rather interesting monument has two crossed Armalites, and I found out rather accidentally that some of the members of Loch Gall are buried here, those people that were killed by the SAS. And again, they're just said murdered by agents of British imperialism, even though they were killed by members of a standing army. They're seen as simple agents or colonialists, and they're not afforded IRA any kind of distinction. And Houston is marked on this sign just down the road from his birth village of Chiapa. And Chiapa has another interesting distinction for one, it was a bastion of Irish republicanism, and two, they clashed with members of the parachute regiment who cordoned off the town of Gall Island and clashed with the local population there after one of the parachutists lost both of his legs in a suicide bomb, or in a regular bomb attack, rather. And again, driving back from this point to my hotel in Derry, we passed through a very British community. Looking through the rear view window, you can see the cenotaph because many members of the community were lost in the Great War. And still in these communities, you have flags flying like the banner of the UVF, a designated terrorist group. This stems from my trip to Derry, where I was staying most of the week I was there, and I parked on the hill overlooking the town, an area which is sort of famous for being a popular spot where IRA members would live and Irish Republicans would live. It had very cheap housing. And as we drive through the streets, we can see the Free Derry mural, which was painted on the side of a gable wall, essentially telling British police, you cannot come here because there are so many active members of the IRA and Irish Republicans that will kick you out and you'll likely be killed. Now, British police still made an effort to go there, but the IRA essentially had a very, very strong grip on the area. And in fact, it still does. And it's very marketable to tourism because basically the Free Derry mural is one of the more popular tourist sites in Northern Ireland, especially for people who have only a passing knowledge of the troubles in Northern Ireland. But in fact, as we'll see later in the video, there are many thriving communities of Protestants on the other side of the river. Now, this is showing their support of CHAZ, or the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Portland, which at the time in America still existed. And it was essentially the same thing. It was a no-go zone for police, a place that said, police can't show up here, you're not welcome. And this stems back to the Bloody Sunday massacre, which is a whole other thing to look into. And these are signs for the more recent 32 county sovereignty movement. You can see their logo, the island of Ireland with 32 over it. And some political analysts say that this is the modern incarnation of the continuity Irish Republican Army, and they consider themselves as a continuation, as their name would suggest, that didn't accept the terms of surrender during the peace process, and as such, they're sort of a mouthpiece, as Sinn Féin was the mouthpiece for the provisional IRA, of groups which are continuing the fight on the ground against British police and against, there's no more British military there. And these are zones which are more or less controlled by the Republican Socialist Youth Movement, a communist organization. And you'll see around Derry and you'll see around other parts of Northern Ireland that these groups are all, they take many different names. They take INLA, Republican Socialist Youth Movement, Continuity, Irish Republican Army, Provisionals, just dozens and dozens of different groups, all of them more or less amounting to radical socialist republicanism. They also take some interest in the cause of children and the cause of UNICEF and prevention of drugs, but that's besides the point. This is another member of the IRA who was killed living in these local low-cost housing areas, and it is not too upscale of a neighborhood, as you can see. And you have other murals here, for example, Free Gaza, because they identify with the socialist movement there, and Rest in Peace, Republican Noah. I'm not too sure, but I saw several signs for him. Here you have Bobby Sands, who led the hunger strike in the H blocks. He died of starvation next to the South African leader. More of the Irish Republican Socialist Party and their youth wing, the Republican Socialist Youth Movement. Now, panning over here to the opposite side, you see their flag. It's not too pleasing of a design. Behind it is the old monument to the siege of Derry, which the IRA blew up back in the Troubles. I think it's interesting they support progressive social causes. You can see the multi-gender flag flying above the gable wall of Free Derry, which was actually saved from destruction when it got bulldozed. Another very, very young child who died. He was only 15 years old. And over here, another very, very young girl who was killed, I believe, just in the crossfire. Which, again, it's incredibly sad, the Troubles. And it's not a one-sided issue. The British were wrong on a lot of issues, and then the Irish were wrong on a lot of issues, because both sides would just bomb pubs indiscriminately. This flower is a symbol of Sinn Féin, which was the political mouthpiece for the provisional IRA, which is now ordered to stand down. Right in front of the memorial, the wall, is a monument to them as well for the H Block, the hunger strike protests. And panning in the Free Derry Square, you can see all of these images tearing down the walls, and you can see big, rather poorly done murals of Che Guevara, and surprising to me, at least, I only have a passing knowledge of this, but they support the NHS so much. I would think that some of them would see it as an extension of British organizations because it is a British institution, but they view it, because they're socialists, because they're communists, as a extension of the workers. It's an apolitical organization. I think is actually very interesting to see, but again, this is just around the corner from the old gable wall, the Free Derry mural, which British police were absolutely not allowed to go into. And here are scenes again from the Battle of Derry from Bloody Sunday, a protest by the Civil Rights Association, which was basically crashed by the Provisional IRA, and British soldiers just opened fire into the crowd and killed many people. Uh, Again, you can't walk around anywhere in Northern Ireland without seeing these just incredibly sad, sobering sights, and looking at these poor communities that are divided on both sides of the wall, really. And that's where I'm standing right now, because I'm looking the Derry city walls down into the Irish Catholic areas, the Republican areas. But just above the walls, literally 10 feet behind me, is the Apprentice Boys of Derry, Orange Lodges, Protestant institutions, and as you go along the wall, you'll see a lot of the history of the British side. For example, this gate, Slaughter Gate, was where the gate was closed on the Catholic King James, who was basically laying siege to the city. And they closed the gate because they feared that the Protestants would be executed, having dominion over over Ireland for such a long period of time. They weren't necessarily the greatest conquerors, and the Irish Catholics who supported King James really, really took issue with the fact that the Protestants were basically owning all of their land and keeping them more or less as indentured servants. But inside you have, this is the Apprentice Boys Memorial Hall, and it's a British institution that has to be guarded, again, because the Irish Catholic community is on the opposite side of this, by these tall walls. Is to commemorate the 13 boys who shot the gates in King James's face. They did this because there was a big political discussion. Do we want to surrender and face a possibility of being executed? Do we want to hold out? And these boys, who were really just apprentices at the butcher and bakeries, decided to take the matter into their own hands. And looking again inside of the Orange or the Apprentice Boys Museum, you see some of the weapons that were used in World War One, because World War One was a huge, huge blow to the British people in Ulster. Ireland was a neutral country. Well, Ireland was still a British colony in World War One, but the British took such pride in going off and fighting for their homeland that they're really given a huge amount of emphasis here. And again, we have more monuments on the second floor and more interesting information for the siege of Derry.
However, in the parts of Ireland inhabited by mainly Protestant English and Scottish settlers that arrived following the Ulster Plantation, people resisted James, fearing persecution under his rule. The walled city of Londonderry was the heart of the Ulster Plantation and a focus for James's Irish ambitions. In late 1688, James's deputy in Ireland, Richard Talbot, ordered the city's Protestant garrison to Dublin to be replaced by the Catholic Red Shank regiment. As Londonderry's elders debated, a group of 13 young apprentices, led by Henry Campsie, took action and shut the city's gates. After some negotiation, Londonderry secured a new Protestant garrison headed by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lundy. Following James's flight from London, Londonderry's officials swore loyalty to William and his wife Mary. Causing great suspicion, Governor Lundy took the oath privately. On 28th of July, as the city neared breaking point, Colonel Mitchelburn hoisted a crimson flag, a cloth drenched in the blood of the slain, from St. Colum's Cathedral. To the Jacobite besiegers, the flag signalled the city's defiance. To the Williamite relief fleet, its desperation. Finally, that evening, the relief ship, the Mountjoy, attacked the boom, its captain, Micaiah Browning, dying of the injuries sustained in the attack. The fleet sailed up the Foyle, and on the 1st of August 1689, the siege was lifted. The courage of Londonderry's citizens had secured the city for King William and delivered civil and religious liberty for all. This marked the beginning of the end for King James. James' ambitions were finally laid to rest following his defeats at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and at the Battle of Aughrim in 1691.
And this is the statue of a British siege reliever's head, statue of George Walker, who was a member of Londonderry, a governor of Londonderry. And you have the Mitchelburn Memorial and the No Surrender, because this is a ethno-nationalist conflict, as is pointed out in their very own murals and their very own information boards, which I think are more or less pretty impartial, surprisingly for coming from the Apprentice Boys Museum. Because it is a ethno-nationalist conflict, they take great pride in their past and their history. And things like the Battle of the Boyne, which made King James surrender, and things like the 13 Apprentice Boys, which happened in the 1600s, are now taken as a very real, very important aspect or facet of modern culture here. And it goes right down to the building numbers. The 13 being the head office for the Apprentice Boys of Derry, referencing the 13 apprentice boys who lost their lives. Again, the Irish blew up this monument here because it represented the siege of Derry, the siege of the city by King James. And you can see how both sides are clashing regarding their past history and its glorification. Much like in the US, the Confederate monuments are being targeted by people who disagree with their causes and with their history, and then you have people trying to defend them. Here are the 13 trees lined up, which represent the 13 apprentice boys who shut the gate in King James's face. And here is roaring a cannon which was used to fire out the first shot against King James. Now, it didn't kill him, but it killed an officer right next to him. And it was a symbol, and it's been widely seen as a symbol of their defiance against the Jacobite Catholic forces. And you can see the purple paint bombs which have been thrown at the Apprentice Hall. But this is the area of Londonderry, or Derry, depending on who you ask, which is mixed. You have Protestants living in a certain section of the city, but it's much of it is just majority Irish Catholic. But as you cross the river here, as you cross the River Foyle, you'll notice a slow change towards British culture. This is the Prian House, and the Prian House represents a great Irish love story, one of the greatest love stories that Ireland has. And in this story, a wealthy landowner loses all of his money because of an addiction to gambling and alcohol, and he falls in love with a 16-year-old girl. And her father, who's overbearing, won't allow him to marry her. So this man, who's now completely penniless, meets with a MP of Donegal, or Donegal rather, inside of this house. And they agree to kidnap her as she is coming from the Dublin Parliament and accidentally end up killing her. Now, they hang the, male lover for this out of murder, and the rope breaks. And the crowd is very sympathetic to the cause because he actually apparently loved this 16-year-old girl. A little creepy by modern standards, but not for, the standards of the time. And the hangman said, well, I can't hang a man twice. And rather than walk away alive, he says, basically, no, I don't want to live anymore without the love of my life. And it shows, reading more into the story, the very weird kind of disconnect. And here you have the flag of Gibraltar and of the SAS, which is sort of like a troll, because the SAS killed 3 members of the Provisional IRA as they had planned to bomb a Remembrance Day event, an event for World War I where they would lay a wreath. And this is overlooking the Irish Catholic community on the other side of the river. But here you have the flag of the Red Hand of Ulster, a British symbol, and the flag of the Orange Order, represented by the purple star and the orange. And people who supported William and people who supported the Protestants are actually represented in the Irish flag because you have a green stripe and an orange stripe. And the aim was to be initially an entire island of Ireland and to be an inclusive country. But here, again, you have a photo of King William. But over here on the left, you have the flag of the London Corporation and Londonderry and their seal, and the photo of the Queen. And here's King William at the Battle of the Boyne riding his horse, and various different Ulster divisions from World War One. And you can see also there's many modern issues they take interest in, such as the paratrooper who's being tried for shooting his pistol into the air during the conflicts in Northern Ireland. And again, here I'm driving further south into Ireland, and this is a community which is only several hundred feet away from the borders with the Republic of Ireland. Again, a very British community. And because it's a British community near the border of the Republic of Ireland, it was seen as a target by the IRA, who viewed them as colonists. And this is the lodge at Darkley. And the pastor at this lodge at Darkley is a survivor of the incident which happened during the trial. Now, the Provisional IRA and the Irish National Liberation Army, which I'll just call INLA from now on, were both on a ceasefire. And this ceasefire had to be, or they some dissidents within the movement wanted to break it because, the UVF was amping up their efforts to kill Catholic civilians. So they pull up to mass as it is happening, where 60 people are outside the church and open fire into them. and I believe 3 were killed and 7 were injured. Somehow, miraculously, they didn't kill more. And when they called in to the British police and to a newspaper to confess to this and claim action, they claimed that they believed they had killed around 20. And at the end of the call, they demanded an end to sectarian killings. And the irony of this, I guess, escaped them. It's incredibly sad. And driving through the village of Darkley, you can see that because it is surrounded by Irish communities and because it is multicultural itself, it has both Republican and Protestant elements to it. It has no real flags flying. They're not showing their national identities as much as the Catholic areas in the town of Derry do. And we're driving here again. Uh, this is another village where a massacre happened at Tullyvallen. And again, here you have a Protestant fraternal organization called the Orange Order. And they were meeting here at 10 p.m. And the IRA drove up with 3 members. 2 of them jumped out of the back of a truck and just started spraying the building. It killed 5 members of the Orange Order. And while I was taking these videos, somebody walked up, a very elderly British woman. She said she was a young girl during this incident, which I believe happened in the 1970s, again while the IRA was on ceasefire. The Catholic Reaction Force, I believe, claimed responsibility for it. And I thought this was a member of those killed, but he was just abducted off his street. He was not involved at all with the conflict, but he was a Protestant, and he was targeted for it. And this church has been closed, apparently, since, for 30 years. And this is my last little stretch of the trip. Here we're going from Belfast to Londonderry. And in Belfast, I had my start on the edge of town near Falls Road. And Falls Road is a famous area for being very Republican. And along the wall, you can see a lot of different posters for Bobby Sands and the Hunger Strikers, the NHS, showing their history fighting in the Spanish Civil War. But as you go towards the outskirts of town, we just pass the barricades. And at 6 p.m. every day, these barricades close because literally about 200 meters on the other side, you have the Protestant counter section of town. And this section is just filled with flag bunting and Union Jacks and the Ulster Volunteer Force banners and flags. And they're very, very, very proud of their British heritage. And because they're so close together, this was the scene of some of the hardest fighting during the Troubles, because people from the Irish Republican side of Falls Road would often just come into this section, Shank Road, and blow up pubs or kill members of the UVF or just random Protestant civilians, and the Protestants would do the same. They would go into the Falls Road. And this is kind of evidenced by some of the memorials, such as the Bayardo. And the Bayardo used to be on this spot before it was entirely exploded. 5 Protestants were killed. One of them was a member of the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was a paramilitary to counter the IRA and also target random Catholic civilians at times in the same way the IRA would target Protestant civilians. And all along this road, you have different murals and things pointing it out. Here you have Welcome to Shankill Road, this is basically the Mecca, the epicenter for Protestantism and for Britishness in Northern Ireland and in Belfast. And you have all these World War I memorials and the UVF memorials right here. And the UVF, again, I believe it got its start in World War I, but people took the name UVF and continued using that as a sort of paramilitary force and really, really revived it during the Troubles as a way to target the IRA. But because the IRA and the UVF they just both devolved into targeting civilians. And you have here the Protestant boy flute band, which would march down into the Catholic sections, singing sectarian music, and these were sort of events which the police had to protect. Here you have a UVF mural and memorial, and the UVF here is depicted as the most recent incarnation patrolling the streets, and the sort of Star of David in the background there is a Protestant youth group. This is a fish and chips pub where it was bombed by the IRA because it was a British business, and they were trying to destabilize the economy here in Belfast. And just one of the parks where they remember World War I. Out of 760 who fought, only 76 returned. And you can see sites like this throughout the British sections of Northern Ireland. Just huge murals of the Queen and British flags. You have Wales and England and Scotland there. And here you have more. This is a mural to some of the atrocities that were committed during the Troubles. You have just random furniture stores being blown up, several different bars, fish and chip shops. And as we pan over to the left, we can see basically it's saying, like, why do they get away with this? Why are they glorified? And why are they considered freedom fighters, especially in the eyes of the Americans? And it's so unusual because they're given this kind of preferential treatment because America likes to see them as an extension almost of the American Revolution. But in reality, they were committing some pretty terrible terrorist actions, as was the UVF. I'm not pretending that one side was better than the other. And as we drive back to Derry, you see a lot of the signs here have been crossed out. The signs that say Londonderry have London crossed out. Now, technically, the city itself is called Derry, but they've taken to calling it Londonderry because it's in County Londonderry. They just want to tack London in front of it. But this is Dungiven, which is midway between Derry and Belfast. And here you have a member of the Irish National Liberation Army, Kevin Lynch. I believe, yes, he died in 1981 with the hunger strikers. And it took quite a while for him to die. And you have a Che Guevara quote. I was told by a Protestant in 2017 that all their guys would kind of gather out and have a party at the pub every time one of these hunger strikers died because they saw it as, one less IRA member. But every time one of them died, they added a sort of new martyr to their cause every time one of them passed. And you have similar sort of public gathering areas to the one we're looking at now in Crossmaglen, where the public would meet. And this is back to the British side of Derry. The streets here used to have murals on most of the houses, but nowadays it's sort of less inflammatory murals, such as this one, who's a member of the, I believe, 36th Ulster Division. He was involved with the World War I Battle of the Somme, and Sperrin Park here has a UVF written over the sign. And another close-up on the mural here of him who returned from the Battle of the Somme. And the Ulster flag, you'll tell this is the British Ulster because it has a crown on it. But the story is a Scottish and an English boat came up to the Kingdom of Ulster, and whoever would touch the ground first had control of the land. So one of them cut their hands off, and that's the story of the Red Hand of Ulster. But here's a mural for the Ulster Volunteer Force, and you have a masked gunman with an AK-47 and an advertisement for the Protestant Unionist Party, which is, again, a very sectarian group that doesn't aim to revive the Troubles, but aims to sort of highlight the history and cause a lot of, tension between the two ethnic groups. And right here, we're looking down because we're on a hill and we can see some of the more suburb areas, the Irish Catholic areas of Londonderry. And from this shot, you can actually see into County Donegal. You can see into Ireland. Here is the town, I believe it's called Bredy or Breedy, and there was actually an American revolutionary that was born in this town. He's the same guy who invented the dollar sign, weirdly enough. And this, again, about a quarter mile behind this church is the border of the Irish Republic, just south of Derry, the city of Derry, as you're coming up from Dublin. And I came to this church thinking that they might have some graves of members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and sure enough, I found someone who was apparently he was a retired member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, who was just a cop, and they pulled him out of his house and executed him. This is the town of, I forget this town's name, but it's just a sort of nondescript town on the Irish Northern Irish border. And looking around, the town is an even mix of Catholic and Protestant. They've got both churches, Catholic and Protestant. But as you look around, again, you can see the history of a British colony here. You have a lot of graves of people from World War I who all fought for, the Royal Army, the Royal Artillery. And as you pan through the cemetery, you start getting an idea of all of these people who sacrificed their lives for king and country. The grave of Thomas Sturdy. And he was killed by a sniper during a continuation of the Irish War for Independence in 1921. And here we're coming back through the town of Kielen, and this is a very contentious area. During the Troubles, quite a few people were killed here. And again, because it is only about a kilometer away from the Irish border, it's seen as a community of outsiders. And because Derry was so popular with the IRA, it was almost like an IRA territory. They would send their fighters down into communities like this. And this is an Orange Lodge. And you can see probably 2 dozen people, it looks like, who were murdered during the Troubles. And they would just grab one, put them in a truck, or execute them and put them in the truck. And then they would escape either into the Republic of Ireland, where the British police could not pursue them, or they would just go into a safe house somewhere in the countryside in an area that's more sympathetic to the IRA, someplace like South Armagh. These are all members of the Orange Order or the Orange Lodge, which were killed. And again, these are the kind of communities along the border. And as we look here, I think that the border zones are so fascinating and unusual because as I drive down from Derry to South Armagh or Derry to really anywhere, you just cross through random places on the border like 10, 15 times almost. And my GPS will give me a notification. You're now crossing an international border. And it's so unusual because it's almost as if, because it is as if, this border was never really meant to be here. It's so arbitrary and the roads were already established before it just became a part of British territory. And here I'm showing, I was talking in the video, but you try to go from one place to another, especially if it's across Northern Ireland, and you end up just going across the border. And it's again showing my GPS in the car. That triangle of area is a chunk of Republic of Ireland within Northern Ireland within uh, Republic of Ireland. It's such a small area, and the point is infinitely small. And it's like when you think of concepts of national sovereignty, how are you ever going to enforce that? And as I pass this purple sign on the left, that's the international border. And here we are in the town of Omagh. I believe this incident happened in 1998, but it was one of the worst terrorist attacks during the Troubles. They had signed a peace agreement, the Provisional IRA, and said, we will no longer commit these actions. So whoever did it was a dissident Republican. And these are taken from the same shot. The bar immediately to the right exploded, and immediately after this photo was taken, the photographer died, but the man and his young daughter miraculously managed to survive. And the Provisional IRA immediately denounced this action, and in total it killed 31 people, all because it was just a random British, I think, furniture store. And this one is a more early memorial to it. It says killed 29 men, women, and children, but I believe a couple of them died much later of their injuries. And this is other sites in the town of Omagh. You have the Gospel Hall, and looking up, again up the main street, the big glass pillar outside of the pub is a very prominent feature here, but it's not obnoxiously prominent. It's a tasteful memorial, and as we pan back over and look to the left, we see the main town center of Omagh. We see the city hall, and we see how people can turn against each other. And we see now how peace has been carried out.